Hello and welcome to Undivided. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your continuing commitment to give common sense a comeback. I hope you all had a wonderful holiday weekend away from politics. I told you just don't look at it if you don't have to. And we didn't do a show on Friday. And I know that this is the only show that you ever watch or listen to. So since we didn't have a show, I know that you took a break for the Thanksgiving weekend. I had a great time. Been kind of on a little trying to lose my COVID weight. So I didn't get to do the gangbusters Thanksgiving that I usually do. But we had a great Thanksgiving nonetheless. And then we went to the Apple Cup over in Pullman because my fiance is a Coug. And I found out via social media, I posted on my Facebook page that I went to the Apple Cup and it wasn't the outcome I wanted. And apparently most of you are UW fans. It's okay. I still love you. I just didn't realize this. I'm marrying into Coug fanship, and so I have to be a diehard Coug or my marriage I don't think will last. So, but apparently a lot of you were very thrilled with the outcome of the Apple Cup. But it was fun. It was freezing though. Oh my gosh, it was so cold. But we managed. Okay, a lot to get to on the show today. We are going to do some Twitter updates because I'm just continue to be fascinated by the complete meltdown over Elon Musk owning Twitter. But he's doing some things I think are very interesting, including finally cracking down on anarchist accounts that exist to plot, to promote acts of violence, acts of vandalism, etc. And so we'll discuss what Twitter has started to do with some of those accounts. Also, I think we finally found it. I think we finally found the line as to what is too woke, even for Hollywood and even for the mainstream media. It has to do with children, high fashion, teddy bears, and bondage. We'll discuss the pushback over Balenciaga's latest ad campaign, which is just wild to me, but the pushback is good. I was actually kind of surprised. Also today, is the state of Washington going too far in giving criminals a second chance? I've been clear. I believe in that people should get second chances. If we want prison to be a place where people can be rehabilitated and go back into society, we want them to be able to be productive members of society. But the Tacoma News Tribune had an article about a man with multiple felony convictions who was knowingly hired to work with some of the state's most vulnerable citizens. I'll tell you, this article will disgust anyone who wants the government and expects the government to act responsibly. But I'll tell you what happened when they hired this guy was sad, but it was absolutely predictable. So we will discuss that. Also on the Twitter front, Apple is apparently threatening, according to Elon Musk, to remove the Twitter app from the Apple Store, which would be a huge blow to Twitter. The problem is that Elon Musk says they don't really understand why Apple would do such a thing. So we'll get into all of that. But first, I've got to start. It's Cyber Monday, and we are a digital show. So I have to start by trying to sell you something on Cyber Monday. I wouldn't be doing my job as a small business owner if I didn't. If you have enjoyed this show for the past year plus, I would love to have a subscription to Undivided be part of your holiday shopping. It's $5 a month. You can subscribe on Patreon, patreon.com/undivided, or you can subscribe on my locals community, brandikruse.locals.com. And I want to tell you what that money will be used for. I mean, obviously, this is my only job. This is what we do. And so subscriptions help us to continue to do this podcast and help me to be able to do it full time. But we have a few things that we're trying to do in 2023. We've already expanded Undivided quite a bit in the past year. We went from 1.5 hour show a week to 3 hour long shows a week. And we want to go even further than that. We're trying to take it to 4 or 5 live shows every week. So that's something that we want to do in 2023. We also need to buy a new camera system for the studio as part of our upgrade in here to be able to have more live in-person guests, which I think will improve the quality and the quantity of interviews. We're also hoping to launch a marketing campaign. You know, there's a lot of people I still run into out in the wild We're like, oh, what happened to you? You just disappeared off TV, and they don't know they don't know about Undivided. So we need to try to reach people who haven't heard about the show yet. Also, would love to hire a producer in the new year and pay more contributors so we can have more voices be part of Undivided and part of our mission to give common sense a comeback. So if you want to help with all of that in the new year, it's just $5 a month to become an Undivided subscriber. I would love to have each and every one of you. And also, it's a fun community to be part of on Patreon or on Locals. When you have a bunch of people there who are paying to be there, it is people who really believe in the mission. And so it's so much less vitriolic on those platforms than like Facebook or Twitter. And it's fun to be able to chat with folks. I also, coming up on Wednesday, I'm doing our monthly subscriber live Q&A where I hang out with subscribers for 45 minutes or an hour and answer questions you might have about really whatever, but typically politics. So if you subscribe now, that's just in time to join our November live Q&A. Okay, that is my Cyber Monday commercial for Undivided. But let's get into the news. So let's start with a few developments on the Twitter front. And why I focus on Twitter so much is Twitter is an incredibly, not only is it entertaining and a little soul-sucking, but it's an incredibly consequential platform for the entire world and for how people consume news and information. So any news about Twitter is going to be significant. And there's a few things that have been going on. One of them just makes me so damn happy I can hardly stand it. So there was a tweet that someone was saying that Twitter has been out there like nuking pedophilia accounts or people who like promote or sympathize with pedophilia, which why wasn't that happening before? Elon Musk said, removing child exploitation is priority number 1. Please reply in comments if you see anything that Twitter needs to address. So Andy Ngo responded to that. If you don't know Andy Ngo, he contributes to the Post Millennial, and he literally wrote the book on Antifa. It's called Unmasked. In fact, I haven't talked about this publicly, but he asked to interview me for that book. But at the time, my bosses at Fox, I believe we had switched ownership to Fox by then, or it might have just been on the brink of that, refused to allow me to. And I, in part, understood their argument because I have been a target of anarchists in Seattle for a decade. It's hard for me to go out at any of the protests that happen without being targeted or physically assaulted. And so their logic was that they thought, since Andy Ngo is like enemy number 1 for Antifa, they thought by me participating in the book or being quoted in the book, it would make me even more of a target and put me even more in danger. And so I kind of understood that, but they refused to let me participate in what has become a New York Times bestseller, Unmasked. But he's also editor-at-large for the Post Millennial. And look, he's become like a controversial guy because he goes after Antifa and the left just hates Andy Ngo for it. But he responded to Elon Musk and said a large number of Antifa accounts operate on Twitter to promote riots, give tips on how to commit violent crimes, and post names, photos, and addresses of targets, plus their family members. And Elon Musk immediately responded to that and said incitement to violence will result in account suspension. And Andy Ngo proceeded to point out a bunch of instances where he personally has been doxxed. He was violently physically assaulted by Antifa. It's something that he's documented quite a bit in the past. But so he was sharing on Twitter a couple of these instances, saying last year Antifa used Twitter to direct comrades to swarm me after I ran into a hotel following a violent street beating. Elon Musk responded, that is a disturbing story, very concerning that Twitter took no action, despite a clear violation of the terms of service. Report in this thread. So I'm going to get into more of this in a second, but the reason this just pleases the hell out of me is Antifa, and okay, first pause. Let's talk about the phrase Antifa, because technically it stands for anti-fascist, which isn't a bad thing, right? And that's the argument we'll always hear is, why are you against Antifa? It stands for anti-fascist. Well, Antifa is a name co-opted by anarchists and anarchists that stand for violence and vandalism. So they've co-opted that word. That is what they call themselves. So if you have an issue with that, take it up with them. Don't take it up with us for calling them what they call themselves. Anyway, I had noticed over the years the extent to which Antifa and anarchists in Seattle used Twitter as a way to organize. It happened during the summer of 2020 in Seattle during Chaz Chop, where they, had these kind of threads going on, where sometimes it would be kind of cryptic language, but it was like this wording that they used to communicate with each other and try to say, hey, here's where we're going, here's what we're trying to do. And it always seemed like Twitter just turned a blind eye to it. like you have other people who are being suspended for incitement to violence or even less than that, and then you had these Antifa accounts that were just operating freely out in the open. And I think this is one of the main problems I had with Twitter, that its terms of service didn't seem to be applied evenly or equally. And so Elon Musk saying, hey, I'm going to take incitement to violence seriously no matter who does it, which is a really good thing. I invited Andy Ngo on the show to talk about this exchange with Elon Musk and what he hopes will come from it. Andy, welcome to Undivided. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Did you expect Elon Musk to respond so quickly to your concern that you raised?
I didn't because everyone has been tagging Elon Musk for a number of months now, actually, and it I was really shocked that he did acknowledge finally something that I've been trying to raise attention to those who are higher up at Twitter, that that platform is the primary platform that are used by far left violent extremists to organize, promote violence, and then to raise funds for um, criminal suspects if they happen to be arrested and face, a prosecution process.
So over the years, and I mentioned this before we got started, but you did literally write the book on Antifa. And I don't know that there's a journalist in the world who covers that element more closely than you do. What had been your experience pre-Elon Musk owning Twitter, when you were threatened on Twitter, or when you saw people trying to use Twitter to organize acts of extremism? What had been your experience with the platform?
Well, I'm so glad I'm speaking with you now because I did write about in my book a little bit about what happened to you back in 2020 in Chaz. So what happened to me was basically just a more intense version of what happened to you. Um, so the threats started off online on social media, things like "you better stop coming," and I ignored most of it because I was naive. This was years ago. I was naive at that time, thinking that I have a First Amendment right to document these activities that are happening in public, and these are branding themselves as protests, and protests um, are meant to bring attention to something. And so I kept going out until eventually I was beaten, hospitalized, and then I've been attacked since then as well. But the role of Twitter is really critical, and this was something that I actually heard with my own ears when I was underground, which is that mutual aid, this is a quote, mutual aid cannot happen without Twitter. And so because the platform can allow people to make accounts anonymously, and then because a lot of these people know who they are in real life, they're already connected to certain Discord servers or Signal chat groups where new accounts can be amplified, where digital flyers are disseminated, telling people when and where to show up. And there are usually dog whistles of things about violence, such as remember to block up, which is to wear head to toe black, cover your faces, bring riot gear, and they'll have various symbols of Antifa. Usually they avoid doing things that are explicitly Antifa and branding a logo, and I think they do that because they're afraid of maybe federal RICO charges or conspiracy charges. So they, in terms of the branding, often keep it more vague, but not always. Um, and then during the course of rioting as well, or the direct action or protest, whatever you want to call it, real time on social media, they will have a whole brigade of people giving live updates. They're listening to the police radio calls. They're keeping a good eye on, and they have people physically out in different locations, letting people know on Twitter, this street there are police, that street has police, stay out, go this way to avoid being kettled. So in real time, Twitter is used also then for them to escape from being arrested in the course of carrying out their riotous activities. And then afterwards, if there happens to be the few arrests, immediately when bail needed, then the links to the various ways to fundraise, whether it be through Cash App or Venmo or GoFundMe, or even some so-called nonprofit groups, these links will be blasted out and shared so that internationally people who are allies and supporter of this violent extremist ideology can pour in money and immediately get their comrades out. So it's a whole system that has been crucial in making the riots in Seattle, in Portland, in many cities extremely effective. And over, many of these Twitter accounts are actually explicitly violating the terms of service of Twitter, such as against releasing private information. And by that, I'm not talking about pictures that are taken in public or names of criminal suspects, as I do, or the booking photos. By personal information, I'm talking about like phone numbers, the names of their family members, their children, and their addresses. And of course, where they work and the phone numbers to where they work so that people can call and make allegations and often lies to get people fired. So, yeah, I mean, the riots in 2020 that we saw in the United States could not have happened to scale and length that they did without Twitter.
Yeah, and I remember talking about that in real time. And I did for the first time, just to clear the air, because we've never talked about this publicly. I don't think either of us. You asked me to interview me for your book, and I was not allowed to do an interview with you for the book. And now the reason that my bosses gave is they didn't want me to be more of a target. But I think you and I are on the same page of, I'd rather be a target and have people know what's going on and be truthful about it than stay silent about it. So I've always not been comfortable with the fact that I wasn't allowed to talk to you for that, but we can get into that a little bit later. In 2020, we saw there would be hashtags they'd be following that had, real-time updates and information. When you saw instances that were clear violations of the Twitter terms of service, were you making a concerted effort to try to report those violations?
I was, but the thing is, the Antifa accounts they wised up very quickly about being reported. So what they would often do is they have developed these mass blocking scripts that can run through and will block, let's say they enter my name and everybody who's following me, all 1 million followers, or at that time it would have been a few 100,000, would be automatically blocked. That means then when, for example, if I happen to bring attention to a tweet, the URL, and post it on Twitter, people wouldn't be able to report it because you go to the account and you've already been blocked. So you cannot even report it as easily. There's another way to do that, which means going on to on the desktop and logging into Twitter's has a separate reporting form. It's more complicated and most people just won't do it. So a lot of the posts that, in my opinion, would be violating terms of service and would likely have been removed just weren't reported. And yeah, and they're very good at keeping their communities insular as well, also for that reason. And another thing I forgot to mention earlier is about the role of Twitter and also identifying the real-time locations of targets they want people to either actually assault or prevent from documenting events. I've seen it happen with you and other journalists, and of course myself. They'll say, hey, this person is here, that, and they will often actually explicitly call for their comrades to go and destroy the camera, break the camera, or somehow prevent them from observing and documenting the activities that are happening.
So do you think that when we're talking about Twitter and changes pre-Elon Musk and post-Elon Musk, do you think that Twitter didn't take Antifa threats of violence or incitement as seriously as other people like the individuals who participated in January 6th? Or was it just that Antifa was using Twitter in a smarter way?
I think it's a combination of both, but probably the far left and Antifa were able to be better at organizing on Twitter because they were allowed to. In certain contexts, Twitter has shown itself to be very, very effective at content moderation. So around 2013, 14, 15, when hundreds and potentially thousands of people in the West were being radicalized and recruited for the Islamic State through Twitter, actually. That's where a lot of these contacts were being made. A lot of the propaganda and videos and content was posted on Twitter at that time. Twitter eventually, under pressure, was very good at removing all of that and being very quick to do it. So there's already a precedent to show that they can do it. And then, of course, when it comes to right-wing violence or right-wing extremism, that is talked about or promoted on Twitter, that is all shut down. And so they obviously have the means to do it. I think, and also, when it comes to even like removing disinformation with so-called misinformation or disinformation about COVID, that was shut down very quickly. But false claims around various police officer involved shootings of people, lies that were used to incite violence, that was kept up. And so I think it came down, in my opinion, to likely, within the personnel and staff of Twitter having an ideological bias that allow them to look the other way and not view the seriousness of the threat that comes from left-wing political violence extremism.
Yeah, it sounds like, and I agree with you, it feels like Twitter had the capacity to squash that kind of chatter in 2020 if they had the willingness to do it.
Yeah, and it's not like in the end that nobody was victimized. We had neighborhoods burnt down. We had police departments that were relentlessly under violent attacks and arson attacks day after day after day. We had people who were maimed. We had journalists who had their cameras destroyed, who were injured in other ways. We had people who were hospitalized, and then we also had it became deadly in Portland as well. People keep overlooking, you know, what really irritates me is that the mainstream press is very quick to describe the 6th of January as a deadly rioting or deadly insurrection, whatever you want to use. But they use, the adjective deadly, which is accurate. People did die that day, but they don't use that to describe the riots that was deadly in Portland, for example. They still use euphemisms such as racial justice protests. That's how I often see it in the paper or record. And the framing of this stuff is actually really important because I mean, this is going more at an aggregate level, but it's what I've seen. And then, in the criminal justice system, in the rare times that there are prosecutions, then when there's a jury, the people are not really informed on actually what happened in 2020 because of the euphemisms that were used to describe the violent, deadly riots in the United States that year.
The CNN fiery but mostly peaceful headline is one I'll just never be able to get past. It's a good example of that. So in the day after Elon responded to you on Twitter, you were posting a couple tweets saying that there had been some Antifa connected accounts that were suspended. Do you believe that's a result of Elon Musk seeing your tweet and taking action, or just a coincidence?
I wouldn't know for sure either way, but I take Elon at his word because I asked him when, like, well, what can we do to to bring this to Twitter's attention when there are all these accounts that do inciting violence, calling for violence, etc. And he said for now, his response on summarizing it to just post here on this thread, which is what I've still been continuing to do now for days on end now, and many of them have been suspended. I always bring receipts, but some of them haven't. So I don't really know what the decision-making process is behind that. It's just I'm just trying my best to show that there are numerous accounts that have for years been able to get away with incitement to violence and calls for murder. And here's the proof, here's the evidence.
How worried are you, though, that this is going to put even more of a target on your back? And is it already? What have you seen or heard since this exchange with Elon happened?
Yes, of course I'm worried. Anytime that my name is trending on Twitter, it usually corresponds with threats on my life or those around me. I have received a threat already, and it referenced specifically the brief communication with Elon and also my tweets about Antifa, and I have referred that to law enforcement. Um, it's it's something I think about every day just because I have paid a very, very heavy price for the beat that I've chosen to focus on. And sometimes it feels actually very isolating too, because I mean, for years I was um, trying to bring attention to all the ways that these accounts organize on Twitter, and I was ignored, essentially. Reports made would come back either as not a violation of Twitter, shockingly, or nothing would happen. Um, Now that, you know, I got the attention of someone high up, it feels in some ways a little bit vindicating because I have like a lot of evidence that I've already posted on the past. So it's very easy for me to bring up these old posts again to show. Um, but of course, I'm scared as well for um, um, th those around me who, yeah, I mean, we're dealing with, the violent extremists that I seek to expose. Often, many of them have nothing to lose, and so, um, yeah, this is, it's it's been a very heavy punishment, and then of course, then on the whole media side, and so what people are posting online are lots of smears to try to ruin my reputation, to make me appear as somebody who is far-right extremist, a neo-Nazi, or unreliable, or a liar. And I mean, I've been dealing with that from like the minute that I became a semi-public figure when I was beaten in 2019. It was actually really surreal because I was still in the hospital and I was seeing how all these blue checkmark journalists, how they were describing me not as the victim of a really serious assault that led to a brain hemorrhage, but rather somebody who's a provocateur who brought it upon himself. So I guess a lot of this is really kind of, more of the same, but it's still um, it's it it's still scary. Yeah.
You know, it's hard to watch the mainstream media pick and choose which acts of violence against journalists are fine and which are something that they need to, explode over. And the mainstream media has completely ignored attacks on you, threats against you, because they don't like your perceived political affiliation, I guess. What do you think? I mean, what impact does that have? I know you spoke about it a little bit there, but I mean, what do you attribute that to, I guess? The mainstream media just completely turning a blind eye to some of what's happened to you.
I think it shows me how corrupt much of the mainstream media has become. I think there's a certain uh, ideological infestation that has come out from a lot of these communication and journalism programs. So you see, well, you see what how I mean, you just look at the Twitter accounts of journalists who work in legacy media and papers or records, and you see what they say. You can see their bias, and that's reflected in their reporting. And so for me, Andy is seen as somebody that's not just unsympathetic, but must be silenced, actually. And it's a lot of journalists who, many of them are, um, particularly in the online news sites, are in communication with the Antifa accounts. They get their intel from them. They get many even narratives. And so, yeah, the goal is to isolate us one by one, and by us I'm referring to people who, people like me are often independent or part of small conservative media, and we don't have the institutional backings to really often withstand the type of pressure that they face on us to really destroy us, right? Make us actually literally unsafe, physically attacked, and then at the end of the day, like deplatformed quite often. It's it was really sad to me. For example, I've been a member of the Society of Professional Journalists for several years, and I reached out to the Oregon chapter where I'm a paying member when I was severely beaten in May of 2021 in the course of doing some undercover field observation in Portland, and they never even responded to my email. And um, when even when the Committee to Protect Journalists have written about me, some of the assaults, they will have like a whole paragraph asterisk saying that Andy describes himself as a journalist, this is in dispute, and it's kind of, I mean, okay, I know a lot of people disagree with my commentary. I accept that, that's fine. But a lot of the video that I recorded in the past, the reason why I did video was actually so that I didn't, so there was no commentary on it. that was intentional, and still that work was also delegitimized. So um, it that delegitimization is actually really effective because then people well, I mean, it's about control and power. It's about directing legitimacy back to themselves and saying anybody else who falls afoul of these certain claims or narratives are untrustworthy. And I'm not somebody who's against necessarily legacy media. I don't want to see all of it destroyed. A lot of that reputation was built up for good reason. And there are a lot of people who identify themselves as journalists who don't really properly fact check themselves and put out a lot of incorrect information. I've always been very clear that it's, and I know you have too, that when I get it wrong, it's important to acknowledge that and to remove that information and to apologize. And so, um, but certainly it's really, um, it does feel like kind of like I'm in this alone, and and sometimes literally that's how it is, right? If I'm the victim of various assaults in the course of my work, there will be no legacy journalists' rights organizations that will stick up for me.
And I see the same thing happening to Jonathan Cho in Seattle. I don't know how close you guys are or what kind of communication that you've had, but I mean, he's been doing some tremendous work covering the homeless crisis. And if anybody took 6 minutes to watch a video of his, it's journalistic by any standard, but he gets absolutely demonized and vilified. The mainstream media here doesn't stand up for him. I've written about it. So it's really sad to see because it is a strategy that the mainstream media feeds into. And so you're not alone, Andy. I'm here for you. I don't know if that means anything, but
It does mean something, Brandy, because you come from the legacy media world, and I think and I see that you still hold yourself up to all those professional standards. So, the fact that you invite me on to be able to share my reporting, my story with your audience that you carried over from your past work, that means a lot because the goal of, you know, my detractors, our detractors, is to make it so that people cannot find out about our reporting, to make us ineffective, to make it so that our reporting doesn't reach any audience.
Let's end with this. On the Twitter front, on Antifa, as you said, you think has been a very powerful tool for them to carry out the acts of violence and vandalism that they have over the past few years. Let's say that Twitter and Elon Musk, they're serious and they really clamp down on those Antifa affiliated accounts. Will they just go somewhere else? Will they just find another place to do everything that they've been doing on Twitter? And if so, what is that platform going to be? What is it?
Yeah, well, first, one thing I wanted to say that I didn't say earlier is that, my goal is not just to see Antifa accounts removed. It's not even really about the ideology. It's about those who specifically call, incite, and organize violence. So to me, it's irrelevant where on the line of ideology it falls on. Um, what I've been trying to bring attention to is there is one fringe element that's been able to get away with it and been able to carry out violence for so much. Now, regarding where they go next, a lot of them are on Mastodon. They're falling back on their Discord servers. They're of course going to. I mean, they have really a lot of very intelligent people in support of the movement, and they're going to organize and re-strategize how to be effective. But for now, denying them the space to be able to organize on the biggest social media platform, or one of the biggest, is a huge blow to them. I mean, I keep making an analogy to Islamic State and jihadism because I do find it actually similar in many ways. We're not seeing a lot of the same level amounts of terrorist attacks by IS sympathizers or IS members because their territory in Syria and Iraq was taken away from them, and that actually really matters. I think there's probably some analogy that over time, as they lose more and more of their ability to openly incite and organize violence on Twitter, it's going to be a huge blow. And they'll group up somewhere else, as motivated ideologues will do. We'll have to see. But of course, it'll be up to journalists and counter extremism researchers to find out where they're organizing next. But unfortunately, there aren't very many journalists doing this, and almost no counter-extremism researchers who focus on the organizing tactics of the far left, sadly.
Well, I think this is a great start. The fact, as we said earlier, that Elon Musk responded right away. There are some counts suspended. I'm looking forward to seeing, how far they take that. So, Andy, stay safe out there to the extent that you can. And where can people find your work?
Andy-ngo.com.
All right. Well, hey, we appreciate it, and we'll have you back on. Okay.
Thank you so much, Brandi.
Okay. On the Twitter front as well. So, this media meltdown over Elon Musk owning Twitter just continues. And they've actually had a lot of people joining Twitter since he bought it. And so I think now you have some in the mainstream media and some on the left who are like, oh, our anger about Elon Musk isn't working. And now they're trying to pressure Apple into dropping Twitter from the App Store, which would be huge. I mean, how am I supposed to use Twitter on my phone? I mean, I'd have to do something else to be able to use it. So Elon Musk sent out this series of tweets directed at Apple saying Apple has threatened to withhold Twitter from its app store, but won't tell us why. He said that Apple has also mostly stopped its advertising on Twitter. And he tagged Tim Cook, Apple CEO. What's going on here, Tim Cook? Although, Elon Musk did say Apple has mostly stopped advertising on Twitter. Do they hate free speech in America? Look, freedom in America means you can advertise where you want to advertise. And so if Apple chooses not to advertise on Twitter, that is absolutely up to them. But what does concern me is if Apple wants to drop Twitter from the App Store without really any explanation, and just because they don't like Elon Musk's politics. I don't think that would go over well for Apple. And I think Apple ought to be very careful about giving in to the mob on this one, because what other apps would be next that Apple would then have to say, okay, we're going to give in to the mob on this and this and this? Because what I've learned in my career is the mob is never satiated. So today it might be Twitter, but tomorrow it's going to be Facebook or Instagram or whatever. So if Apple wants to take Twitter out of the App Store, I hope that they're smart enough to think ahead to what would be next and the potential consequences of doing so. It just seems ridiculous to me. And it seems like it's just part of this kind of groupthink freak out over Elon Musk. One more Twitter story, just one more. Elon Musk is saying that he's contemplating sort of trying to restore public trust in Twitter for those who it's been broken for, by releasing internal deliberations about how Twitter chose to handle controversial stories. Chief among those is how Twitter squashed a New York Post story about Hunter Biden's laptop ahead of the 2020 election. You'll recall that at the time, so the New York Post had that story, which was exclusive at the time, about Hunter Biden's laptop, about relationships with foreign powers, etc. And it was before the 2020 election. And basically, if you sent that New York Post article out, it was like immediately squashed. Like Twitter would not let you share it. And so one of the things, there was someone calling on Elon Musk to make public all internal discussions about the decision to censor the New York Post story on Hunter Biden's laptop before the 2020 election in the interest of transparency. And Elon Musk responded to that saying, this is necessary to restore public trust. So right now, the conversation is that Elon Musk might release internal chat logs from Twitter where they discussed and deliberated what they were going to do with this New York Post story on the Hunter Biden laptop, which it's kind of gone uncovered. But now all of a sudden, the mainstream media has verified that the Hunter Biden laptop story was true after calling it a conspiracy for so long, which just fits in the narrative of like yesterday's conspiracy is today's mainstream news. So I really hope Elon Musk does this, because I think it does. I agree 100% that it would help to restore public trust for him to do that. And at the same time, I think it would make up for the 2+ years that the mainstream media has buried that story by bringing decisions over why Twitter buried it to the forefront. And also, I think it would be really fascinating for Americans to know who wanted to share that story, who thought that story was well reported. I think it would be very good for them to know what deliberations Twitter was making behind the scenes that put that story to bed before the 2020 election. So, just a few stories about what's happening in Twitter land. I shot my shot with Elon Musk on Twitter today. I told him, Elon, come on the show, Elon. Do you think he'll respond to my tweet and come on unDivided? Come on, Elon. We're just a humble little podcast in Seattle. Because he tweeted, just a note to encourage people of different political or other views to engage in civil debate on Twitter. Worst case, the other side has a slightly better understanding of your views. Elon, that's what we do on unDivided. Come on the show. We'll chat about all of it. The following segment is presented in partnership with Future 42. Turn your frustration into action at future42.org. Criminal justice reform has become this resounding movement in Washington state. And look, there's a lot of that I buy into. This idea that, we shouldn't throw everyone in prison for the maximum amount of time and throw away the key. This idea that we need to allow people to be rehabilitated and to be able to have productive lives once they're released from prison, to try to clear barriers, barriers to housing, barriers to employment, barriers to voting once they're out of prison, because those are all the things that can help them stay on or get on a good track and stay there. So I do believe in those things. But I also believe that sometimes the state goes a little bit too far in this idea of criminal justice reform and giving people second chances. And the Tacoma News Tribune had a story that was very revealing, that showed an example of the types of people that the state is willing to employ. This story has to do with Western State Hospital hiring a man who had multiple felony convictions, including pending felonies that the state knew about when they hired him to work at Western State and to work closely with some of the state's most vulnerable citizens. So here's the story in the News Tribune. The headline: Records. WA hired ID thief, heroin dealer to treat mental patients. He stole their money. The story was written by Sean Robinson with the Tacoma News Tribune. He joins us now on unDivided. Sean, welcome to unDivided. Thanks for being here. How'd you get your hands on this story? Was it a hot tip or a...
It was the most mundane thing. All news outlets have a news tips account via email, and we have one too, just like everybody else. And the Department of Health sends out news tips every couple of days, sometimes more than once a day. And it's an email called Suspensions and Revocations, and it just lists healthcare professionals by county. So they sent out that standard thing, and I noticed one back in September because I always scan it because I edit most of the time more than I report now. And I always just check to see, okay, is there anybody local in here? And I see Pierce County, and I see this guy, and I see money's been stolen from patients at Western State Hospital. I'm like, wow, well, that's different. What's going on here? Surely someone has written about this. And no. And then I'm like, okay, well, now I got to find a little more. And was this guy charged with a crime? And no. And I'm like, okay, what is this? I have to go find out now. And that rabbit hole just kept getting deeper and deeper and weirder and weirder.
Yeah, good for you, because those are the little emails that are easy to skip by, but good journalists, they find those little nuggets and just run with them. And that's what you did here. It's a really interesting article to read. And similar to you, I'm sure when you're looking at it, there's just so many layers that keep revealing themselves where you're like, how did this guy work for the state for so long? So first, just to get it out of the way, and I'll offer my opinion on this story after this interview, but, I don't believe that people should be, one felony and you're done and you can't ever hold employment again. And certainly there's got to be room for second chances. But tell me a little bit about Mr. James and kind of his brushes with the law before he even worked with the state.
First of all, I'm glad you said that because I'm kind of with the same mindset. Second chances are good. Redemption is good. I want to believe in redemption. I don't want people to be, condemned forever. But there's that, and then there's just putting a bottle of bourbon in front of a recovering alcoholic. So I ran this fellow's record, meaning Mark James, and it was quite long. Went all the way back to the early 90s. A lot of drug offenses, a lot of theft, forgery, sometimes charges kind of combined or were consolidated. And so not every single one of them led to a conviction, but there were 22 felony convictions prior to his hiring. And they weren't, they weren't violent offenses, but they were crimes of what's called moral turpitude, which is a kind of a term of art within the world of healthcare and employment, where you took advantage of the situation you were in. And he had done that. He'd forged his checks on his employer's name. He had, been a user and a dealer. The most recent convictions before he was hired were a set of forgery and ID theft cases dating the original incidents dating to 2006, and then the courts kind of, crank it along into 2009. And that was what the state was looking at when they hired him in 2017. And my first reaction, again, I was still not all the way down the rabbit hole, was, oh, okay, well, maybe he lied. Maybe he hid it somehow. And then it's like, nope, they ran the background checks and picked him. And to your earlier point, it's not an instant disqualifier. If he had had sex offenses, I think, they probably would have DQ'd him instantly, but he didn't. But he still had these basically moral crimes. And they went, okay, all right, you got the gig, but go ahead.
Yeah, and he also, crimes of moral, I haven't heard that phrase in a long time, but it's, also crimes of opportunity. And so, you look at that and think, okay, you're going to work with some of the most vulnerable people, sometimes people who just do not have the mental capacity to protect themselves or to say anything. And that's ripe for a crime of opportunity. So they hire this guy knowing his background. He also had some pending cases at the time of his hiring out of Oregon. Is that correct? Can you explain that?
Yeah, that was another thing that just kind of gobsmacked me. It's a two, let's see, 2 weeks before he's officially hired, he's charged with dealing heroin, 2 counts of that, possessing meth, cocaine, drugs down in Eugene. And a week before he's hired, he's in the Pierce County Jail on a fugitive warrant out of Oregon. And then he, waives extradition. They take him down there. He's charged. He pleads guilty after he's hired. And, I think it's 5 convictions while he's a state employee. And this is 2018 when the convictions hit. He's already, his salary starts at $44K, and then it jumps to $88K because he has a credential. And then by the time these incidents begin in 2020, he's making 118. And I'm like, well, that doesn't suck. That's pretty good money. And I kept looking at it going, God, part of the question in my mind that was key to me was, why would you do this? Because it's small money that he steals from these poor people.
Yeah, and I want to get to how he kind of takes this money and siphons it over time, but just so we're clear, his employer, the state of Washington, clearly knew about the Oregon cases too, because I think the one thing out of everything in the article that stuck out to me is his direct supervisor actually wrote a letter to the court for sentencing in Oregon while he's employed, talking about what a wonderful employee he is. So there was no doubt they knew 100% what he had gotten himself into.
Correct. Absolutely right.
So when do they start to realize, or when does his sort of effort to, because as you point out, he's making 6 figures, he's making good money. And explain to me, so just because I think I was even a little confused by this, some of the folks who are at Western State, the patients who he's tasked with caring for or working alongside, Why do they have money that's being kept on the premises?
There are different categories of patients at Western State. And one thing that's true of virtually all of them is that they're not prisoners. They're patients. They're there for treatment. These particular patients reside in an area called the Habilitative Mental Health Ward, which is a big fancy word, but it's part of the civil commitment side of Western State. So these are not people who have been committed with some linkage to potential criminal activity. They're not, waiting for competency or anything like that. These are civil commitments. They are developmentally delayed patients. They are adults. And they have money because they can't, I didn't say that right. They have money because they live there and they have real lives and families and connections, but they they need treatment and care, and the money is tied to sort of their real lives outside the hospital. And it's not like there's these giant boxes of cash that are sitting there. It's they have accounts, and the accounts have money in them. And on this ward, which is called the P5 ward, there was a cash drawer, petty cash drawer. And the patients are allowed to take out small amounts of money, no more than $50, for little treats, snacks, movies, gifts for mom, or they can leave, they can go to the movies, they can do things, but there has to be this little process where their supervisors and staff are supposed to say, okay, why do you want this? I want to buy a gift for mom, or I want to get a Subway sandwich. Okay, we approve that. You can take this money out, and that money is hereby withdrawn from your account. But it's physically there's this petty cash drawer where they keep that money, and it's supposed to be monitored. At least the way it was set up at the time these incidents occurred. It's kind of like I don't know if you or any of your viewers would remember those kind of honor system snack boxes.
Yeah.
I'm talking about. You've got your chips and your candy or whatever, and it's, please make a donation. Please put quarters in the cardboard hole. And, amazingly, a lot of times people don't do that. They just take the chips.
Yeah.
And this cash drawer was kind of like that, in that theoretically, Mr. James would, on behalf of a patient, would say, well, I'm going to take out, $40 for patient X, and patient X wants new shoes. So I'm taking it out, and there's my form that says it, but there's supposed to be a second signature from another supervisor that says, okay. And you're supposed to bring a receipt that says, okay, here's the shoes. And I was struck, I'm mentioning that one because it's in the story. There's one particular patient who had special shoes, and Mr. James takes out money in $40-$50 increments 4 times in 2 weeks and says, this is for shoes. And later the investigator goes and talks to the patient and says, did you the patient is known for having these special shoes, and they ask the patient, did you get new shoes? And he's like, no, I've had these for a year. And it's like, okay, that doesn't look like very strict oversight.
No. And we'll get to kind of how what they're gonna do, the changes moving forward. But what is their first indication that he's been stealing money from these patients?
Somebody does. This is buried deep in records, but it's someone discovers in, I think, February of last year, that these accounts have money missing with no correct record to say why. And so they conduct an audit at Western State, and they find, oh my God, this has been happening over and over and over. And there's 13 different patients this has been happening to. And, who took the money out? Oh, okay. And so they go through this process, and they're like, wait a minute, this is all tied to one person. And there were some indications where he was taking money out for people he did not supervise. directly. It would just be someone's name, like, well, you don't work with Mark. How come Mark's taking out money for you? So that internal audit, so to speak, takes place. And then there's kind of what looks to be a little flurry of administrative activity, and then they confront him. And the exact date of that confrontation is not clear to me. It's sometime in March of 2021. By that time, he's been withdrawing these small sums for 9 months. And they take away the access that he has and say, okay, wait a minute, now we're going to run an investigation.
So I think one of the things that kind of bothers me throughout, I mean, there's a lot of things. You're taking advantage of these people who, can't fend for themselves, and that's just horrible. But, you've got this guy, comes into the hiring process, 22 felony convictions. When he gets hired, he's got pending felony convictions. He gets convicted of those. They write a letter on his behalf. It's crimes of opportunity. He's working with the vulnerable. And then they catch on to this, and they don't, and perhaps you can explain why. They don't fire him. They don't put him on even paid leave. They put him in the kitchen. Is that correct? For 7 months?
Yes, this is true. By his own account, that's what he describes. And I interviewed the deputy CEO of the hospital. That's what happened. So the basic thing is, not just for this employee, but any state employee in theory, you get accused of doing something wrong, and then there are these rules tied to the labor contract that says, okay, we can't just fire you until we prove it. So while we look at it, you get to do something else, but we're going to take some kind of a step to at least separate you from this crime of opportunity, as you're calling it. And, so you can go work in the kitchen while we figure this out. But it takes a long time.
Well, and is there anything precluding, obviously, and I understand the labor laws and stuff, and I think until you can do an investigation, it's not fair to just fire someone outright. I mean, that doesn't make a lot of sense either, but why not? Did anybody explain why it wasn't like even leave with pay? So he's out of the building, away from those people.
The only thing I've got is this repeated assertion that, well, employees have rights. We cannot just suspend them in the absence of findings.
Crazy. That's crazy. That doesn't make any sense to me that they wouldn't get him out of that building. So you got to speak to Mr. James. It sounds like you guys had a conversation. I don't know if I'm assuming that was over the phone, but what did he admit to, and what was his level of remorse, if any, for what he had done?
He didn't admit to anything. He didn't deny anything. He was very cagey, and I did manage to track him down. I did talk to him over the phone. He is in Oregon now. I had been kind of poking around trying to find him because that was the one question I wanted to ask. Why would you do this? But he didn't admit anything. He said, "Oh, well, I was a scapegoat. There's a lot of corruption out there. They didn't charge me," which is true. They didn't charge him. I went through the background checks. I'm not a violent guy. I'm not a sex offender, which is true. He's not those things. They knew. Yes, they did. And, I had my degrees. I have a graduate degree. I have these credentials. I am not a bad guy. I hope they do just fine. I wish them the best. And understandably, he's not going to, when he's talking to a reporter or any stranger he's never met, just flat out admit to a crime.
Yeah.
But it did surprise me that he kind of tried to say, well, everybody's corrupt over there, and I was just the dumb pawn.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So
I mean, he does have a point that they did hire him. I don't blame the 22-time felon for seeking employment. I mean, that's kind of on the state to decide, are we going to hire him or not? Their eyes were wide open to the situation, but obviously I blame him for allegedly stealing from the patients there. You mentioned there were no charges. Why? Because there was, according to your article, an investigation.
Yes, there was. So DSHS, which is the oversees Western State Hospital, which is a subset of that agency, Department of Social and Health Services, just so we understand the acronym. They ran their internal investigation. It's 730 pages, details all the stuff with the patients. They hand that off to the Lakewood Police Department. And a Lakewood police officer reviews the investigation, looks at the evidence, talks to Mark James, talks to staff at Western State, and says, well, I think there's probable cause for first-degree theft here. And he says that because the amount stolen is over the threshold for that charge, which is a felony. So they forward that to the Pierce County Prosecutor's Office. Pierce County Prosecutor's Office says, no, we're NCFing this thing. And the reason they give is twofold. One is that the victims are not going to be reliable witnesses. Some of them didn't want to talk. Some of them just couldn't, which I think is just so damn sad. And the other part is that the system of tracking the money from this dumb little cash drawer, this, is so weak and so, unsupervised that they couldn't, get it across the goal line for a clear charge. Now, I don't know if I've covered a lot of criminal cases, and I know prosecutors only like to take cases they can win. And I'm not questioning the judgment of the prosecutor who made that call, but it sure seemed like maybe there was an option to try. I don't know. I understand the reasoning. I think maybe there's room for debate there.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, it is, I think, one of the most tragic parts of this, the victims that he chose, not being able to really help facilitate a prosecution, and maybe that was strategic, but I tend to think that based on everything you laid out, there was so much evidence that all of that stolen money came back to him. Just to end with this, Sean, and I'm putting my political pundit hat on, I see, a state that wants to give felons a chance at gainful employment and just took it too damn far. I mean, and that's truly what I see. But you spoke to the state and folks in charge. Do they acknowledge that this was a bad hire? Are they going to change anything moving forward?
Yes, they acknowledge it was a bad hire, in the sense of saying we're not in any way saying this was a good hire. We're saying the process. We're not saying the process was followed correctly. Now you could argue, okay, well, it actually looks like you did follow the process correctly. It's just a bad process. But they are saying it was the convictions sent red flags up. The decision was made further up the food chain by the chief operating officer at the time, who was since retired. The deputy CEO who I talked to says, we are making sure that we watch for these red flags, and we're not going to let this happen again. Mea culpa. And it's kind of rare, frankly, when you get someone that far up the food chain to just fall on their sword, so to speak, and say, yeah, we screwed this up. I think the one other factor that is worth mentioning here, not just the second chance thing, not just felons, but this particular job, this particular place, it's really hard to hire people for it. People don't want to work there. People don't want that job. That's been true there for a long time. Western State has always had difficulty hiring people who are qualified to do those jobs because the patients are difficult. It's hard. And, it's not the easiest thing in the world to do, even though it arguably pays well. So I think that is also a factor, is they were desperate for people.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Although, you said they're going to look out for red flags. Like, how many red flags were there? 27? Which felony was going to be the brightest red flag for them? Oh, that's government, though. Sean, really good stuff. I really enjoyed reading this story. I don't think we see enough stories like that out there. And so good for you for spotting this one and for digging deeper. So thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Brandi.
So now that Sean has given us the sort of journalistic facts and details of that story, let me just offer my opinion on all of this. I feel like anyone with an ounce of common sense, if they really cared about having quality individuals serve in these roles around our state's most vulnerable citizens, would have had some serious, serious hesitation in hiring this man. I also just cannot get past the fact, again, as I said earlier, I believe that we have to have second chances for folks. I believe we have to let folks be rehabilitated and have a chance at getting their life back on track. But there's a difference between that and hiring someone with 24 felony convictions to be around vulnerable people. And not only that, to be around vulnerable people, to be consistently given promotions, to have your salary go from $42,000 to $120,000, to then be caught stealing, not to be fired, no criminal charges, no criminal conviction, and you just get to go on your merry way like nothing ever happened. And the one thing I can't get past, and the one thing I keep coming back to in my mind, is, well, Mark James is gainfully employed with the state, making six figures at the very same time the state of Washington is firing people for not having the COVID-19 vaccine. You tell me what world that makes sense in. The preceding segment was brought to you in partnership with Future 42. Turn your frustration into action at future42.org. I wasn't sure if we would ever find the line where something was like too woke for Hollywood and too woke for the mainstream media, but this might be it. You might have seen these images circulating from Balenciaga, which is a French high fashion brand. So they were ads that ran on Instagram, and in them they had, I'm not kidding, they had little children who were holding teddy bear bags, okay? But the bags had these teddy bears in like sexual bondage gear. And then in this photo spread, one of the photos had this desk with a bunch of documents laid out. And if you zoomed in, the documents were about a court ruling about child pornography. So again, this is a fashion brand. And you have a photo spread that has little kids holding teddy bear bags where the teddy bears are in sexual bondage gear, and there's court documents about child pornography in the pictures. Like, I'm sorry, but is that? That's crazy. And so at first, when I saw the outrage over this, it was like strictly conservative media that were like, what the hell is this? And I thought, surely, I just pray to God that there's going to be some widespread outrage over this and some realization from the mainstream news and from Hollywood that this is not okay. And I'm thankful to report that today, most of the mainstream outlets have done something about this in terms of stories and coverage. And the key kind of celebrity who works with Balenciaga is Kim Kardashian. She does, if you follow her on Instagram, a ton of shoots for them. She wears their clothing all the time. And she has spoken out saying that she's disgusted and outraged over the ads and is reevaluating her relationship with Balenciaga. Now, I'm not in favor of somebody, immediately just in response to outrage, pulling their support or whatever. And I do think there's a little more to this, and I'll get into that in a moment. But, some people have criticized Kim Kardashian for not doing enough, but this is one of her big, big brands she supports. And so the fact that she's coming out saying, this is her quote, "I've been quiet for the past few days, not because I haven't been disgusted and outraged by the recent Balenciaga campaigns, but because I wanted an opportunity to speak to their team to understand for myself how this could have happened. As a mother of 4, I've been shaken by the disturbing images. The safety of children must be held with the highest regard, and any attempts to normalize child abuse of any kind should have no place in our society, period." And I give Kim Kardashian credit for that. I think for her to take the time, a few days, to reach out to the people she's been working with at Balenciaga and say, what the hell happened here? I think that that's an appropriate response and the type of response that we should get back to. Now, what she does from here, I do think is going to be important. But Balenciaga has come out and actually sued the production company it hired to make that advertising campaign. So they're basically saying, I think, with this lawsuit that, hey, we weren't I'm going to take issue with this, but we weren't responsible for the imagery. We hired a production company to make the campaign. So they're filing a $25 million lawsuit against that company. So they say that they hired an independent production company called North 6 and a set designer out of New York to create the ads for the company's Spring-Summer 2023 collection. And they say that they had no knowledge that the campaign photographs would include a document, that court document I mentioned, that had language about child pornography on it. They go on to say in their lawsuit, because they're suing for, quote, extensive damages, they say members of the public, including the news media, have falsely and horrifically associated Balenciaga with the repulsive and deeply disturbing subject of the court decision. But here's the thing. Balenciaga can't convince me for 1 second that it doesn't look at the ad campaigns it has produced on its behalf. That's bullshit. They don't just hire a company. Nobody does that. Just hires a company and says, just do whatever you want with our product and we won't look at it and we'll just post it to Instagram. That's stupid. So for Balenciaga to think people are that dumb is ridiculous. And in fact, a spokesperson for the set designer in the company said everyone from Balenciaga was on the shoot and was present on every shot and worked on the edit of every image in post-production. This has all been blown out of context, and we are hiring a legal team to support Nick, who's the set designer, on this, which is why no one has commented yet. And I 100% believe that Balenciaga saw the images. Now, whether they knew there was some weird court document that mentioned child pornography, I have no idea. But at the same time, I was happy to see outrage across the board about these images and for it to go beyond conservative media, because I do think there's a hesitancy from the mainstream media, from celebrities to speak out about this kind of stuff when it comes to these fashion brands. And I think that this was a good step in the right direction of saying, okay, there are some things that are too woke enough. There are some things that simply cross a line, and this is one of them. Okay, it's Monday, so we end with some of your comments. A ton of comments on the subscriber-only episode last week. I did a story about 32 BIPOC leaders of Seattle area nonprofits getting up to $60,000 each to go on vacations. And like sabbaticals. And it had just struck me about some of the nonprofits that these people run. One of them, who got an award to go on vacation, runs a nonprofit that, quote, dreams into what queer ancestral futurism and other alternatives to modernity could look like through mentorship in place-based skills with awareness of post-industrial globalized ecocidal contexts. And so I was like, they just make shit up to get money. It's like you call yourself BIPOC, you make up some program, and then you get money and you get to go on a paid vacation. It's ridiculous. And one of the things that I noted, this story was originally reported in the Post Millennial, was that these organizations have been the beneficiary of taxpayer funds. So you guys really had a lot to say about this particular story. Darylyn said, who needs Nigerian scams? Just come to Seattle. We'll fit you right in. I think the taxpayers and law-abiding citizens need a paid vacation for all we've endured. How about $60,000 for each year we've survived this city? That's funny. Joshua says, funny how everyone is so outraged over this kind of stuff, yet the same corrupt politicians always seem to get reelected. I don't disagree. Vance says, this is so outlandish and sick. I cannot stomach it anymore. Let's see. Sherilyn said, because one of the things that was said is they need these vacations to heal and get rest and restoration. Sherilyn said, we need to heal from what the city is doing to us. This is beyond crazy. How long do us taxpayers have to keep putting up with this nonsense? And I will note, because I thought it was pretty clear in the segment, it's not as if taxpayers are funding directly all of this vacation money. this organization is, and they have benefited from taxpayer money in the past. So it's an organization that's been supported with taxpayer money, but it wasn't like the city of Seattle is writing a check for these vacations. Dee Dee says, I want off this ride. This is ridiculous. Oh my gosh, let's see. Patty says money laundering at its finest. Don't disagree with that either. Oh, let's see. Yeah, I mean, you guys all, I don't think there was one comment on this where somebody said, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like if you as a nonprofit, and $60,000 a month, or $60,000 for 3 months, so $20,000 a month to be on a sabbatical, is that how much nonprofit leaders get paid? If so, we all need to be working in the nonprofit private sector. Let's see. One more. Denise says, well, common sense just isn't very common these days. We have reached a new level of crazy for sure. Denise, I agree. And that's why we have this podcast. So we all have a place, a little respite from the insanity, a place where we can call insane things insane, and we don't have to apologize for it or make an excuse for it. All right, that's it for today's episode of Undivided. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your continuing commitment to give common sense a comeback. Matt, one of our subscribers, is like, you keep saying that, but is that one of those things where common sense will never make a comeback and so you'll always have a show? I don't know, Matt. We're just trying to give people with common sense a place to be. We're trying to grow our movement to bring more people with common sense into the conversation and encourage them to speak up and to not apologize for saying that things like $60,000 sabbaticals are absolutely ridiculous. All right, I will see all of you subscribers on the subscriber-only show on Wednesday. And remember, Wednesday evening at 7 p.m., we're having our November live monthly Q&A for subscribers. So if you want to join that, you're not a subscriber already, it's not too late. You can become a subscriber for as little as $5 a month on Patreon, patreon.com/undivided, or by becoming a contributor on my locals community, brandikruse.locals.com.